You are listening to WCAT Radio, your station for quality Catholic programming. Your selected program will begin right after a word from our sponsor, GroupM7.com, a web design and hosting company. Log on to GroupM7.com today and let them know that WCAT Radio sent you.
You know, my finest childhood memories was the Saturday morning movies for about 4 bits each. My brother and I could split a Coke and a big box of popcorn and watch movies about Tarzan, Jane, and their Amazon River adventures. Well, maybe that's where Jeff Bezos took his name. His Amazon.com is now the largest online retailer in the world. I'm Michael Mahfood with Group M7, the oldest and largest website design firm in East Texas. And here's my point, and as usual, it's a good one. If your website is modern and up-to-date, mobile and search engine friendly, it matters not whether you sell a product or provide information about your goods and services, your sales justifiably will increase just like theirs. The world uses the internet. We can improve your website and your email. Look at our giant portfolio at GroupM7.com. Since 1995, there's only one web and there's only one group, and it's us. It's Group M7.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt and effort to both examine my life and encourage you to examine yours. So this time around, I'm going to be doing something, I'm going to take a little break from the focus I've been doing on story, and I want to talk about why you should take the vaccine. And by that I mean one of the available COVID vaccines. And to my knowledge, at least in the United States, there's 3 different variants of it that you can get. The Johnson & Johnson one, the Moderna one, and the Pfizer one. I believe if you're overseas, there's some different ones that have been developed over there as well. But the data I have available right now is only on the Johnson & Johnson, the Moderna, and the Pfizer one. So I'm going to give you 2 arguments, which I think are compelling, as to why you should take the vaccine. One proviso before we get going here, and that's that because I'm dealing with matters that are outside my area of expertise here, that is, I'm trained in philosophy and arguments and being rational and things like that, not in medicine and vaccines. Well, what I did to try to offset that is I asked my wife, who is a practicing physician who stays current in her field, to listen to this and tell me if I got anything wrong. And she said, nope, you're right, this is all good. So I've done my due diligence in that regard, at least. And I've been inspired to do this in part by some of the ridiculous nonsense I've been seeing on the internet of people making excuses as to why they shouldn't take the vaccine, most of which is insanely stupid. And if you're offended by that, well, I'm not sorry. It just is. Not 95, 98, maybe even 99% of the objections I've read to why people are saying, oh, I shouldn't take the vaccine, is really just dumb, and most of you should know better. But in the off chance that you don't know better because nobody's told you, well, now I'm here to tell you. Now, I say 98, 99% because, well, hey, there's always a chance that I'm wrong. And also, when you're dealing with things like medicine, vaccines, and stuff, you have to operate by things as a general rule. It's not a universal principle that everyone should take the vaccine, because some people have odd or unusual medical conditions wherein they can't take the vaccine. Some people have odd or unusual medical conditions wherein they take the vaccine and it's not going to be very effective. People who have weakened immune systems, who have certain types of cancers, who have certain odd genetic abnormalities. There's some people who may have allergies to some of the ingredients in the vaccine. Very, very rare, but that being the case, no, you shouldn't take the vaccine if you're one of those people. Now, 999 times out of 1,000, if you are one of those people, you already know about it. So if you're making that excuse and you haven't been diagnosed with one of those conditions, you're probably just full of garbage, honestly. So, I'm going to make 2 arguments that you should take the vaccine. I'm going to make a practical argument based on risk management, and then I'm going to make a moral argument that you have a moral duty, at least most of the time, to take the vaccine. And then if there's time after I get through all that, I'll answer objections people make that I've seen commonly come up on the internet, again, most of which are just so obviously wrong that it's really odd to me that people who can actually read and write cannot see through this. And I'll also go through a little bit part of what I think is going on in the background, why it is that so many people who are otherwise intelligent, who can do things like read and write, are seemingly unable to see through all the garbage surrounding this and coming up with easily answerable and very, very dumb objections to why they should take the vaccine. Okay, so diving right in, we need to make some distinctions here to make it easier to talk about this. There is a distinction between what is legal and political and what is moral or ethical. That is, you should do certain things, and it also should be the case that probably the government shouldn't be able to force you to do that. So, you should always tell people the truth in your life. You should always resist any urge to lie and do your best to tell the truth, no matter what else is going on. Excepting perhaps very odd, unusual, and rare circumstances like when you're hiding the Jews from the Nazis in World War II or something very unusual like that doesn't apply to most of our lives most of the time. Now, at the same time that I've said that you should always tell the truth, I would also want to argue quite vehemently that as far as the legality and the politics of it all go, the government should never, ever pass or enforce a law that says you cannot lie under any circumstances. It would almost certainly create far more unjust and unnecessary suffering for the government to go around punishing everyone who lies about anything all the time than it would be for the government to just stay out of that and only punish lies if, like, they're under oath in the court of law, or it relates to you defrauding somebody out of their money or something like that where there's something else connected to the lie. If it's just a lie where you're telling an exaggerated story, or because my 5-year-old daughter doesn't want to get in trouble so she lies to me, the government should have no business dealing with that. So when I say you should take the vaccine, whether you buy the practical argument or the moral argument, it doesn't necessarily follow from that the government should be forcing you to do that, because that brings in a whole other host of issues. And so right from the get-go, I'm going to say there are a lot of people who are objecting to the idea that the government is going to force them to do that. Well, as of now, that's not happening. And if it did happen, I think we should be rightly very suspicious of that, because we should be rightly very suspicious of any time the government tries to force anybody into doing anything, because the government is generally pretty bad, even at doing good things. You give the government an initiative like, hey, let's feed people who are hungry and give homes to the people who are homeless, and it's going to find a way to mess it up. Feeding people who are hungry and giving homes to the homeless is a good thing. Likewise, taking this vaccine is a good thing. If the government starts forcing people to do it, good chance it would find a way to muck it up and make it bad somehow, because that's what the government does. So, if your primary objection to the vaccine is in relation to issues with the government, throw that aside, because as of right now, the government isn't forcing anyone to take the vaccine, and the U.S. government did not develop the vaccine. Rather, what happened is, last year, due to former President Trump's Operation Warp Speed, or whatever they called it, the U.S. government went to the pharmaceutical companies like Johnson & Johnson, like Moderna and Pfizer, and said, hey, develop the vaccine, and we'll fund it for you. That is, we're going to cover all your R&D costs. We're going to just cover it all, so you won't take any losses, even if you, throw resources into a line of research into the vaccine that turns out to be a dead end, which normally, if these companies were doing the R&D themselves, they'd have to pay for. The government said, nah, we're pretty much going to cover it for you just so you can get the vaccine done and we can get it out sooner. That's one of the reasons why the vaccine came out so quickly. And that's the reason why there's at least 3 different variants of it. So no, the U.S. government did not develop any of these vaccines. These pharmaceutical companies did, and they were able to do it very quickly because the U.S. government said, we're just going to foot the bill for this. So that's the first distinction I want you to keep in mind. There's a distinction between what you morally and ethically should do and what, legally and politically speaking, the government has the right or the ability, or should have the right or the ability to force you to do it. And I'm not really going to get into whether or not the government should force you to take the vaccine, because that's not happening anywhere in the United States. If it does start happening, that'll be something worth talking about and arguing about and figuring out, and we should usually be pretty skeptical of the government, but the government is not forcing anyone to take the vaccine. So that's a non-issue. So the reason why I'm giving 2 arguments, which is a practical argument and a moral argument, is that those are really the only 2 reasons why anybody should or should not do anything, which is for practical reasons or for moral reasons. That is, you eat food, Probably because it's practical and helpful in keeping you alive. You do lots of things for practical reasons. There's lots of decisions that we make that are good for practical reasons, and sometimes we're off bases and we make decisions that we're like later, well, that wasn't very practical at all. I made a foolish decision. So practical reasons are a good reason to do something, or in some cases not do something. And likewise, the other reason we would have to do things is because it's the morally right thing to do. Many of us all the time will say, well, I did that because it was the right thing to do, even though it wasn't practical. And if you're right about that, if your moral intuitions and knowledge was right, then that's a good thing where, hey, you did the morally right thing even though it was impractical. You inconvenienced yourself to help out a friend of yours who really needed your help. Well, it wasn't very practical because you got inconvenienced, but it was the morally right thing, so that was a good call on your part. And as that example alludes to, sometimes what's practical and what's moral conflict with each other. Sometimes what's very, very practical will be deeply immoral. Sometimes what's very moral will be deeply impractical, etc. Well, in this case, given the two arguments I'm going to make for you, it's actually very practical for you to take the vaccine. It's good risk management, and it's also the morally right thing to do. So the practical argument I'm going to make here is just very loosely that unless you're one of those very few rare people, the 1 out of 1,000 or so, and my numbers on that might be a little off, maybe it's a little higher or a little lower, but one of those very rare people who cannot take the vaccine because it's going to harm you, because you have a rare genetic disorder where vaccines don't work on you, you're allergic to one of the ingredients in it, or something along those lines. Unless you're one of those people, it's always going to be less risky for you to take the vaccine than to not take it. When you're dealing with medical issues, and deciding to take the vaccine or not is a medical issue, it is a medical decision, it's really all about risk management. This is one of the things that my wife instilled in me the first couple of years we were married that I hadn't really considered before, but everything you do as far as medicine goes, there's risk involved. I had my appendix out, about 2 years ago now. Now, that's a pretty standard surgery that happens all the time, but there's a little bit of risk involved. There was something that could have gone wrong, wherein, hey, maybe something goes wrong in the surgery. The surgeon nicks a blood vessel that he shouldn't or something like that, and I could die on the operating table. Now, that's a pretty commonly done surgery. I had a pretty good surgeon, so the risks were very, very minimal, but they were still there. However, in the case of appendicitis, you don't pull that appendix out. It's not quite a guarantee, but just about a guarantee that I was going to die. So the risk was worth it. That was how you do risk management. And that's how doctors are trained to think about these things is, well, look at the risks involved, and if you've got very, very minimal risk here and very, very high risk here, go with the option with the very minimal risk. That can get messy and problematic when, say, you've got roughly equal risks on either side. Such as, say, the surgery is very, very risky because the patient has health conditions or something that makes the surgery dangerous, but the condition that the surgery is intended to correct, well, that's going to be lead to a fatal outcome if they don't do something. So that can be iffy if you're in a scenario like that. But with the vaccine, it's not like that at all. The risks involved in taking the vaccine are less than minimal, and what you're offsetting is significantly more risky. So what I'm arguing is, unless you're one of those very, very few exceptions that I mentioned, which if you are, you almost certainly know you are, the risk involved with you getting the vaccine is always going to be less than the risk involved with you not getting the vaccine. Now, as everybody has been harping and telling me about on the internet, fortunately it is the case that the COVID virus has turned out to be less deadly than was initially predicted, and that's great. It still killed over 3 million people worldwide, and as of the last numbers I looked at, over 500,000 people in the United States. That's not nothing. That's worse than the flu. And in fact, it's anywhere between 9 and 42 times worse than the flu, because the CDC estimates that around 12,000 to 61,000 people die annually from the flu. So it's much, much worse than that. it definitely is the case that if you're young and relatively fit and you get the virus, yeah, your odds are pretty good. But young, fit people have still died from the virus. Young and fit people have still gotten very, very sick with the virus. I know some young and fit people personally who are still struggling with after effects of the virus months or even almost a year later at this point, where they almost have asthma-like symptoms because of how badly the virus affected them, even though they were, I think in one case, younger than me and probably in much better shape physically and much more physically healthy than me. Further, just statistically speaking, the vast majority of us in the United States are overweight, even to the point of perhaps being obese, which means, hey, you have a pre-existing condition if you're one of those people, and that puts you at a greater risk for the virus. Pardon me, not for contracting the virus, but for needing hospitalization or even dying from it. Now, when it comes to the vaccines, if you're getting the Moderna one, it's 94% effective at preventing you from contracting the disease. The Pfizer one is 95% effective, so hey, if you got a choice, get the Pfizer one. The Johnson & Johnson one is not nearly as effective. It's only rated at like 66%, although I don't think that one's getting rolled out to the same degree. Now, what some people have liked to bring up on the internet is they'll bring up something like an anecdotal example of, hey, I know this person who got the vaccine, one of these vaccines, and then he died. Or they'll cite examples where they'll claim, 2,300 people have died from these vaccines or something along those lines. Now, I think in general we should be very, very skeptical of those claims, but even if I wasn't skeptical of that, even if I just granted this person, say, okay, 2,300 people have died from taking one of the COVID vaccines and the media hasn't reported on it, they've covered it up or whatever. Well, as of May 9th, when I last looked up the data on this, there have been 153 million doses of the vaccines given out in the U.S., and since that was 10 days ago of the time I'm recording this, I'm sure the numbers got up. And 117 million people have been fully vaccinated, meaning they've completed both shots of either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. So again, I'm skeptical of claims like that, but suppose I just give the people who are making all these objections that claim. Well, that would mean if, say, 2,300 people had died, and taking the lower number of the 117 million, what the percentage would be 0.00019, which is not only less than a percentage point, it's less than a half a percentage point. It's less than a quarter of a percentage point. The number is so small that when I ran the math on my calculator, it did it in scientific notation where it has to round up, where it has to put an E to 5 number to indicate how low the number is. What that means is, even if 2,300 people had died from getting the vaccine, your odds of actually dying from getting the vaccine are so low that you have better odds of winning the lottery every time. Or for another example that some people have cited, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was halted being given for a while by the CDC, and I don't know if they've started it again or not, but it was halted because there were some cases of blood clotting issues with some people who took that vaccine. And as of May 12th, in the news report I'm looking at, there were 28 total cases amid a backdrop of 8.7 million Johnson & Johnson vaccine recipients. So, if you're worried about that, that means that the number of people who got the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, who then had blood clotting issues, was even less than the other number. It was 0.0000032. An incredibly small number. Again, you have much better odds of winning the lottery than you do of getting a blood clot from getting the Johnson & Johnson vaccine at that point. Honestly, your odds are significantly better of going swimming in the ocean once and being eaten alive by a shark at that point. Now, in the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and blood clotting case there, the reporting's all coming from relatively well-established sources, so I don't doubt that there's some kind of an issue going on there, but they halted it for that incredibly small a percentage of people who may have had an issue, which should tell you that the processes of how they go about these things are probably just working just fine. If they're going to halt it for an issue which in any other instance would be written off as even less than a statistical anomaly, this is such a small amount that if you try and graph it mathematically, it's not even going to show up. That's how small it is. And they halt giving the vaccine for that reason. Well, that should tell you they're very concerned and this is a safe process that you can trust. So, this is the main point I'm trying to strive at here. You look on the internet, you're going to find anecdotal stories of people who said, oh, my friend got the vaccine and died, or this happened, or this happened. Safe, again, I think we should be very skeptical of those things, but say for the sake of argument, I just give you all that. Given that 117 million people have received the full dose, and that was as of May 9th, it's certainly more than that now, even if I just give you all that, the odds of you actually having something bad happen to you from the vaccine are so remote that you'd be dumb to make that kind of an objection, because it's just that astronomically small of a number that it's not even worth your time to consider it in risk analysis. If you really think that based on those objections that people have raised that there's a chance you're going to die from getting one of these vaccines, then you need to go out and start buying a lottery ticket every single day, because your odds of winning the lottery are much, much, much better. Now, additionally with that, another practical thing to consider is, well, what's it going to cost you to get the vaccine? And as best as I can tell, it's available essentially for free to everybody. I mean, the government's paying for it. It's not like it's magically free, but the government's already paid for it, and they're going to pay for it regardless of what you do at this point. Now, of course, depending on your circumstances, maybe your insurance company's paying for it rather than the government. But the point here being, you can get the vaccine with no out-of-pocket cost for yourself. And that is relevant because even if you're doing something where the risk is non-existent or really, really low, if there's a high cost involved in other ways, so it costs you, say, a great deal of your time, it costs you a great deal of your money, you have to expend a lot of resources to get it, or something like that, well, in that case, even though the risk is low, maybe it's just not worth it for you to do it. A good example of this is I have heard of numerous examples of, say, people who have the resources who travel overseas to get medical treatments for, say, over to Russia or somewhere else like that where the medical laws are different, so they can get certain treatments there that they cannot get here in the U.S. And I've only heard stories of how that worked. I'm sure there are multiple stories of how that doesn't work, but the point being, say you need that treatment and you've done all your research and you're convinced that this treatment that they offer in Russia is very low risk versus your condition, which is very high risk. But you don't have the money or the resources to go do that, so then it's not a viable option. Well, likewise, if the treatment or whatever you're talking about doing is relatively low risk, but the resources are that it would take from you, the amount of money and things like that, is really, really high, well, maybe that offsets it to the point where you shouldn't do it anyway. Well, in the case of the vaccine, it's just not that way, because what it's going to cost you is absolutely nothing, essentially, almost nothing. So it doesn't cost you anything except the time it takes for you to go get it, and in some cases, you may feel a little sick the next day or two. I did on both of the doses I had. I felt a little down the first time, and I think the second time around I felt worse off, like I had a cold or something along those lines the second time around. So that could happen too. But that's not that big as far as a commitment out of you. That doesn't cost you very much. It costs you nothing monetarily. It costs you a little bit of your time. So what you're being asked to, so to speak, sacrifice to get the vaccine is not really that much. It's actually very, very little. And on top of that, the evidence is now starting to show that these vaccines do help mitigate and prevent the spread of the virus. So not only are you doing it for yourself, but you'd be doing it for other people. Almost all of us know people who are going to be at risk for the virus because they're older, they have pre-existing health conditions or something along those lines. And so by getting the vaccine, you're helping to mitigate the spread of it to them. You're not putting your friends and family at risk. Oh, pardon me there. I slipped into giving the moral argument. I'm not quite to that point yet. So again, point of this practical argument is, unless you're one of those very few rare people who cannot take the vaccine due to allergies or an unusual disease or something along those lines, the risk you entail by taking the vaccine is always going to be astronomically less than the risk you entail by not taking the vaccine. People of all ages have died of this virus. Yeah, your odds are much worse if you're over 60 and overweight and have a heart condition or something. But young, healthy people have died of it too. And the vaccine has been proven effective 95% of the time with Pfizer, 94% of the time with Moderna, 66% with Johnson & Johnson, at countering the disease the virus gives you. So, when the risks you entail by taking the vaccine are so astronomically low as to the point where they really wouldn't even qualify as a statistical anomaly, and it costs you nothing, then you don't really have a good practical argument against getting the vaccine. And I'm sure some people might want to say, well, maybe you were a little off in your numbers there. What if, say, 20,000 people died from getting the vaccine instead of the 2,300 number? I just used the 2,300 number because I saw some people on Facebook claiming that a while back. Well, what if it's 20,000 instead of 2,300? Well, even then, you're still looking at a number that's about 10 times less than 0.0%. 10 times less than 0.01%. So, again, your odds are still better of winning the lottery. Now, part of what I think is going on here with these types of objections is that most people simply do not understand how statistics work. And the fact of the matter is, if you do anything more than 100 million times, you're going to have a few instances where something odd or unusual happens, just because you did the same thing 100 million times. Take somebody who is not a professional basketball player and never even played basketball in their life, and have them go to the half-court line and throw the ball at the basket 100 million times. They're going to miss it probably better than 99% of the time, but I bet you they're going to sink it a couple of times. It doesn't prove that they're a great basketball player and you should put them on their team, on your team or something like that. All it proves is they did the same thing 100 million times, and when you do the same thing 100 million times like that, occasionally something weird or unusual happens. And so when you hear people making anecdotal claims like, well, my friend's brother died after he got the COVID vaccine, that's a much better explanation for what's going on. It's highly unlikely it had anything to do with the vaccine, but even if it did, the risk you entail is so astronomically low you should do it anyway. Again, even if I just give all the people who are objecting to this all the numbers they want, of all the people they're claiming have had negative effects from the vaccine, who have died from it or whatever, which I'm skeptical of and I don't really believe them, but even if I just give them that, you entail greater risk by getting in your car and driving to a restaurant to eat dinner there and coming back home than you do from taking the vaccine. And here I'm not even talking about COVID. I'm talking about your risk of getting in a car accident. I'm talking about your risk entailed of getting food poisoning at the restaurant, or being there when, say, somebody comes to rob the restaurant and maybe you get shot. Your risks of all those things are still significantly higher than the risk involved in you just getting the vaccine. Now, if you want to dig a little bit more into the details of how you do risk management outside of this particular context, I talked about that a little bit back on episode 67 at the start of the pandemic, where I referenced Pascal's wager, because Pascal's wager really is just all about risk analysis and how you do that. So that would be worth referring to, again, if you want to dig into that with a little more depth. So that's the end of the practical argument. Now I'll move on to the moral one. Now, this moral argument does require one moral assumption from you, but I think it's a pretty basic one that the vast majority of people should agree with, and if you don't agree with it, I'm going to be a little suspect of you. And that basic assumption is that you have at least some moral obligation or duty in some sense or some way to the other people around you. You could categorize this as something like the non-aggression principle that's used in libertarian political philosophy, where you have an obligation to not attack or steal from other people. It can be that basic. You could even up it a little bit and say you have an obligation to, in as much as you can, do good for the other people around you. So the good example of this is you're walking down the street by a river and you see a man drowning. Do you have an obligation to help? Well, I think so. I think you have an obligation to at least try something. Maybe not necessarily dive in the river and save him, but hey, we all have cell phones now. Call the police or the rescue people. Shout for help. You have an obligation, in most cases, in most senses, to at least try to do something. Now, obviously, that's affected by the real-world scenario. I would say you have an obligation to that man, but if you can't swim, then I don't think you have an obligation to dive in and try and save him, but you do have an obligation to try something. Conversely, if you're an Olympic swimmer and you're, at the height of your game as far as being a good Olympic swimmer, it isn't something that you did 30 years ago, but it's like you won the gold medal yesterday, well, then you probably do have an obligation to dive into the river and try and save him because, hey, you could do something about it. On the other hand, if, say, it's like the fastest flowing river in the world with severe undertows and there's rapids just that would kill people just a mile down the river, and the man's going to be there at those rapids in like 10 seconds, well, maybe you don't have an obligation to dive in at that point, even though you are the Olympic swimmer, because maybe diving in wouldn't do any good and you just get yourself killed as well as that guy killed. So all this moral argument really requires is that you acknowledge you have at least some obligation in some sense to the people around you. And you can make it as weak as the non-aggression principle, where the only obligation you have to the people around you is not to attack them or something like that. You don't even necessarily have to have, strictly speaking, very much in the way of positive moral obligations to them. Now, it does seem to me, and I think this is a pretty common thought in moral philosophy as well, that you have an inverse relationship. Your moral obligation to people has an inverse relationship to the risk you assume in rescuing them. That's why I brought up the example of the Olympic swimmer and the man drowning. Well, if you're a paraplegic, you don't have an obligation to dive in because that would be extremely risky for you. The Olympic swimmer doesn't necessarily entail as much risk, depending on the context, so the obligation on him would be higher. And I even think you can cash this out a little bit more, although this is a bit more controversial in moral philosophy, but I think this makes sense, where I would want to say you have a greater moral obligation to the people who are closest to you in your life than you do just random people in general. So I have a greater moral obligation to my wife and my children than I do another random citizen of the United States. I have a greater moral obligation to my extended family, like my brothers and my parents, than I do a random citizen in the United States, but I think that moral obligation to my extended family isn't as high as it is to my wife and my children. And you can extrapolate that on outward to friends and citizens of other countries and so on and so forth, where I want to claim you do have at least a basic moral obligation, and maybe it's just the non-aggression principle, to every other member of the human race. But you have a much higher moral obligation to those who are closest to you. And there's that inverse relationship where the higher amount of risk it would take upon you to perform some moral duty, the less of an obligation you probably have. It's very morally praiseworthy to throw yourself on the grenade when you're in active combat to save the rest of your buddies. But do you have an obligation to give your life to save them in that way? Probably you don't have an obligation of moral duty for that, even though it's very morally praiseworthy and it's a good thing. So there's a good distinction to draw there as well between things that are morally praiseworthy and things that you have an obligation to do. A good way to cash that out is if you have a moral obligation or a duty to do something, then failing to do that is a moral evil. Where if it's simply something that's morally praiseworthy, but you don't have that obligation, then failing to do it isn't morally evil, but there does seem to be something better or more virtuous about the fact that you do it. So with a little basic moral philosophy talk out of the way, again, I'll reiterate, I think all you need to make this argument work is that you just understand you have at least some type of moral obligation or duty to other members of the human race, and basically it's that you just don't go around doing evil to them. So, here's roughly speaking the argument. Getting the vaccine mitigates the spread of the virus. It at least slows it down, if not stopping it outright altogether. If everyone got the vaccine, probably around 90-95% chance the disease would die out. That's what's happened with other diseases like smallpox and other things like that, which pretty much only exist in labs now because enough people got the vaccine that the virus essentially died out in the natural world. You can only find it in labs now. So, getting the vaccine, therefore, is something that's good not only necessarily for you, but for the other people around you. It's good for humanity in general if the coronavirus was extinct. It's even better for the people who are closest to you because you will not be passing it on to them. Further, as I established in the previous argument, the risk you entail in getting the vaccine is very, very low, and it's not really going to cost you anything, at least not anything of significance as far as time and resources. Therefore, I would want to say you have a moral obligation to get the vaccine because it's going to be good for the rest of the human race in general. It's going to be good for the people around you. And it really doesn't cost you anything, so you have a moral obligation to get it. Now, this isn't as strong a moral obligation as something like to say, not go out and murder people, but it is still there. So you might say it's kind of like a weak obligation, but it's still a moral obligation even if it's a weak one. Okay, so I'll sum this argument up here by giving you some key premises. First is, you have some type of basic moral obligation to other human beings. Second is, there is an inverse relationship between your moral obligation to other human beings and the amount of risk you involve and the amount of risk you entail. And at some point, the level of risk becomes so high that you probably don't have that obligation anymore. Which is the whole point of the example of the drowning man. Third, the amount of risk you entail in taking the vaccine, unless you're one of those odd or unusual people I mentioned, is low, so astronomically low that in most cases it would be considered like a statistical zero. A statistical zero is an actual zero, but it's when the number is so small you can round it down to zero. And this number is even smaller, exponentially smaller than what you would round down to zero. So the amount of risk you entail in taking the vaccine is exceptionally low. Fourth, taking the vaccine does decrease the odds that you're going to spread the virus to other people, that members of your family would, like, say, have to quarantine or other things along those lines. I mean, quarantine isn't the end of the world, but it is an inconvenience, and it does hurt people's, like, social relationship, possibly hurt your job or other things like that. In fact, the harm you entail by having to quarantine, either to yourself or other people, is significantly greater than the risk you entail by getting the vaccine, because that risk, again, is so low. Now, technically speaking, of course, the odds of transmitting the virus are not zero after you get the vaccine. Like all things in medicine, no vaccine is absolutely perfect and going to work completely perfectly, absolutely 100% of the time. Because almost nothing in life is perfect or certain, and like I said before, this is all about weighing and managing risks. But the odds that you're going to get the virus and transmit it to others, or the odds that you're going to just get the virus or just transmit it to others, both go way, 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 way down. And at that point, you've pretty much done all that you can be reasonably expected to do. Like, if you wanted to eliminate the risk completely, in theory, you could go live in a cabin in the woods that you built by your own hands and never come into contact with any other human being. You'd have zero risk for getting the virus, and you'd have zero chance for ever giving it to anybody else. But that's not really a reasonable response. It wouldn't be reasonable for people to say, expect that response from you. This would be akin to how every time you drive somewhere, there is a risk that you could hit someone with your car and kill them. It's a relatively low risk if you're a decent driver and you're safe and cautious, but it's there. Now, you could eliminate that risk by never driving anywhere, or by every time you drive somewhere, driving only like 5 to 10 miles an hour, so that if you did hit somebody, the odds that it would kill them are like nil. But that's also not a reasonable response. I mean, what's the point of having a car if you're only driving at 5 to 10 miles an hour? You might as well just walk everywhere. Rather, the reasonable response is to drive in a responsible manner that obeys the traffic laws, that where you maintain your car so your brakes aren't going to fail, or other things like that are going to happen. To not drive under the influence of drugs and alcohol and so on and so forth. The reasonable response is to take some basic steps to minimize the risk and still drive your car to wherever you need to go. So likewise, you could completely eliminate any chance of spreading the virus by doing some very, very extreme things. But it's not reasonable for other people to expect that out of you, and it's not reasonable for you to do that. Rather, what's reasonable is, like with driving, to take basic precautions that are appropriate for the circumstances in which you live. And so, a year ago, that probably was things like avoiding unnecessary social gatherings, wearing masks and things like that. And now that the vaccine's available, that's the appropriate precaution to take, is to take the vaccine, both for yourself and for other people. And in point of fact, the precautions that you take when you drive, assuming that you're a reasonable driver, already cost you more time and money than just taking the vaccine will. You have to devote more of your time and resources to driving cautiously and appropriately and safely than you do to just getting the vaccine. It's really that easy. So the point of this one is getting the vaccine does good for other people. Therefore, given all of those, you should get the vaccine. And that's the moral argument for getting the vaccine. Okay, now, the objections I've heard to this generally take a couple of different forms. There's what I'll term meme objections, where people say things like, well, I'm going to choose my faith over fear and go with God on this one. Or I saw somebody put one up a while ago that said something like, it's not a conspiracy theory to trust my own immune system. And things along those lines. And generally speaking, what most of those things do is cast a false dichotomy where they're trying to say, oh, I either can have faith in the vaccine or I can have faith in God, but not both. Well, obviously that's a false dilemma. You can certainly have both. And furthermore, the idea that you're acting out of fear, well, we all act out of fear all the time. It's part of the reason why we're still alive. When the Bible says don't do things in a spirit of fear, or God has not given you a spirit of fear, I don't think it's talking about, hey, there's a tiger in that pen. I'm not going to be scared the tiger's going to hurt me, so I'm going to walk right in there. No, it's pretty wise to be scared that the tiger would attack you if you walked into his pen, or something along those lines. Likewise, when the disease has killed over 500,000 people in the United States alone, and there's such a low risk entailed with the vaccine, it's not fearful or not trusting in God to get the vaccine. It's actually being wise and diligent and doing good risk assessment. Or take that other one where it said something like, it's not a conspiracy theory to trust that my immune system will work or do its job or something like that. Well, that's a false dilemma as well, because it's trying to castigate it as, hey, if I just trust my own immune system, you're going to tell me I'm a conspiracy theorist, and I'm not going to give in to threats like that, so I'm not going to take the vaccine, which is sort of kind of like a false dilemma. But that's also completely ignorant, because the whole reason the vaccine works is because you do have a functioning immune system. If you don't have a functioning immune system, the vaccine will not work on you. That's how vaccines work. So whoever put that one together is clearly lacking some basic medical knowledge, or what, I don't know, but maybe they didn't even give it much thought. And most of these meme-type objections really don't have very much thought behind them. Generally speaking, most of the time in life, if somebody comes to you and says, well, it's either this or that, they're probably giving you a false dilemma. Especially if it's a meme that somebody shares on Facebook or Twitter, it's probably a false dilemma. Not always. There are things that are either or. But most of the time, if it's an either-or thing shared on Facebook or Twitter, it's a false dilemma. Now, the second type of objections that I'm seeing are ones that I've kind of already covered a little bit, where people are objecting to worries that the government's going to force them to take the vaccine, or that it's too political, or something along those lines. And as I already established, the government really is not forcing anybody to take, it is not forcing anybody to take the vaccine. And it didn't really have anything to do with the production of it and the development of it. It was these various pharmaceutical companies that did this. So if your worry is that you don't trust the process by which these vaccines were made because the government was involved, you're wrong. The government was not involved. And if you don't trust the process, then I suggest you go look up the process, because all of the relevant data was published in medical journals. All of the relevant data that's available, all the relevant data is available on the manufacturers of the vaccines websites like Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson, and so on and so forth. It went through all the various boards and oversight. Now, it was approved a bit quickly for emergency situations because it is a pandemic. So that is true, but that's not really a warranted reason for saying, I don't want to take it. If there was something seriously wrong with any of these vaccines, given that over 117 million people have taken it at this point, you would see some numerous examples of people who were having ill side effects or something going terribly wrong. You can't give something that's iffy or has problems to over 117 million people and not start to see some significant evidence of that. And some people are expressing worries, well, what if the government forces me to take it? Well, it's not doing that. if the government does force you to take it, hey, that would be kind of problematic because, as I said at the start, you can draw a distinction between what you should do and also say that that's not something the government should be able to force you to do it. You have legal and political rights that are different from what you morally and ethically should do. You have the legal and political right to go smoke 15 cigars and drink 3 bottles of scotch every day. Now that's really, really stupid. You absolutely should not do that. You'll almost certainly die of some terrible diseases because that's going to ravage your body if you do that. But you do have the legal right to do that, and making it illegal to smoke 15 cigars a day and drink 3 bottles of scotch every day would probably do greater harm in some other ways than it would prevent, even though that would probably improve public health in some sense. Likewise, you do have the legal and political right to refuse the vaccine, but it's also stupid if you do that. You should get vaccinated. But at the same time, politically speaking, it would probably cause more or greater harm to force people to get vaccinated than otherwise, so that shouldn't happen. But it's not happening, so that's not a relevant objection. Now, another objection that is kind of in the same category was when people say, oh, it's too political, and by that they mean, hey, Dr. Fauci has said obviously political things where he said stuff that were where he was under political pressure from either then President Trump or now President Biden or other people in those administrations. Or something like, hey, the CDC has made political decisions that aren't driven by the data, or something along those lines. The CDC is too political is one that I've heard. And that's not really a good objection either if there is actually strong data backing what they're doing. Like in the example of the CDC, you go to their website and look at their guidelines. What they're giving you is an amalgamation of what the current best research on this stuff says. And as more research comes out in more medical journals and more people are doing lab tests and things like that, they update that. So even if the CDC is political, and even if you think it's too political, where like the guys who are writing all this, the amalgamation of all this data, and like the director of the CDC are political appointments who you're like, oh, they're just dumb. They have no business being in this position because they're political appointees or something along those lines. Well, even if I give you all that, which I think we should be skeptical to say it's so simple as, oh, it's just politics. Things are usually more complicated than that. But even if I give you that, if you can trace what the CDC is saying on its websites back to the hard data that's been published in medical journals and that everybody can go have access to and that doctors have reviewed, that boards of doctors have reviewed, if you can trace it all back, then it doesn't matter whether or not there's politics involved. If it's good data and they're giving you an amalgamation of recommendations based on good data, then it's good data and you should follow it, regardless of whether or not the people involved have political motivation for saying so. It's the same thing with actual politicians in our country. It's very, very doubtful that whoever's listening to this podcast has a lower opinion of politicians than I do, because I tell people every year, never vote for the incumbent because as soon as they're in office, they're part of the problem. Get rid of them all, every time. But if, say, President Biden, when he's giving a speech, says something, well, it's certainly political. He's the president. But if there's good data and evidence behind what he's saying, then he's right. So if he tells people, hey, you should do this because this is what the experts are saying, and you go look up the data and that is what the experts are saying, and these experts know what they're talking about, well, then he happens to be right. Even though President Biden is by definition like the most political you can be, because all politicians are the most political you can be. So in the case of claims like the CDC is too political or the WHO, the World Health Organization, is too political, well, probably they are. I think it's pretty despicable that how the World Health Organization basically let China lie to them at the beginning of this pandemic, and if they hadn't, things probably would have gone a lot better. The World Health Organization is too political. But if what they're telling you conforms with the good data that is done by respectable researchers, doctors, and medical experts, then what they're telling you is right, regardless of how political or not political they are. Now, what I think some people don't quite understand about this because everything's gotten too political is, generally speaking, in politics, changing your mind is considered an absolutely horrible thing. But when you look at how actual scientific research is done, if new data and evidence comes out that suggests that what you were saying earlier was wrong, then changing your mind is the best thing you can do. And that's partially what you saw happen as this pandemic went on, is at the start of it, almost nobody knew anything about it. Very, very little was known. And as more data has come out, hospitals have been able to treat the disease better as a result. So the survival rate of people who've had to be hospitalized for COVID has gone up considerably. And consequently, the recommendations of how to deal with the virus, what kind of social distancing you do and don't need, when you shouldn't and shouldn't wear masks, all those kind of things, that's periodically been updated and revised as more and more data has come out. And that's not to say that politicians haven't mucked it up by saying stupid and contradictory things, because they do. As I say over and over all the time, our government is incredibly incompetent. But the fact that recommendations and guidelines were changed as this went on is not a sign that things were going badly. That's actually a sign that things were going right, because as more data and evidence came in, those things were revised. And that's how science and medical research actually is supposed to work. It's not a bad thing when they change because new data comes in. That's how it's supposed to work. If new data came in and they did not change, as some of the politicians have done, then that would be a bad thing. And what I mean by that is there's numerous examples in some states where, hey, some of the initial restrictions and procedures that were put in place to try to slow the spread of the coronavirus were shown to be ineffective or not very useful as more and more data came in, and the politicians, because they know it's going to cause them all kinds of political problems if they change their mind, decided to go ahead and stick with those things anyway, even though data was coming in saying, no, this doesn't work. So the last objection I've heard, and this is one that I also find pretty bizarre, is some people have been trying to make a moral objection to taking the vaccine in relation to abortion. And one of the reasons why I find this so bizarre is if you go do your research, you'll find that no cells from any aborted children were in any way used in the development of the vaccines. You're not going to get like cells from an aborted fetus injected into you if you get the vaccine. I've heard conflicting things about how maybe in the past some vaccines had that, but as best as I can tell you, no vaccines have that today, and the coronavirus vaccines definitely do not have that. And you can just go do research on this yourself. Numerous Christian organizations have done research on this and reported that, the cells from aborted babies were not used in the development of these vaccines and are not present in the vaccines. Now, it is possibly the case, I don't think anybody's confirmed this, but it's possible, maybe even probable or likely, is that lines of human cells, and that is human cells that are grown in laboratories, were used to test these vaccines for toxicity. That is, they have human cells that they grow in a laboratory. They'll take dosages of the vaccine, introduce this vaccine to these cells, and see if the cells live. And that's a way you can do an initial test for toxicity, so that you can be a bit more sure that when you give the vaccine to people, they're not immediately going to go into toxic shock syndrome and die or something along those lines. So it is possibly the case that some of those cell lines were developed from cells that were originally taken from aborted babies, because there are cell lines that are in use by research companies that are themselves descendants of cells that were taken from aborted babies. Now, to be clear, unless my knowledge of the biology of this is way off, those cells are not themselves the same cells that were taken from those aborted babies. Rather, they are descendants of those cells. So I've heard some people objecting to the very notion that any type of fetal tissue or human tissue that was acquired through the means of abortion could be used in this type of a way. And to that, there's really two responses. The first is, if you're going to be consistent, then you'd have to object to a whole lot more than just the vaccine coming from COVID. You'd have to object to a great deal of the pharmaceuticals and other things that are used in modern medicine, because that same procedure is used to test quite a lot of them. And to my knowledge, I don't think you could rule out the possibility that, say, even the very basic medications that you take were, when they were initially tested on human cell lines that came from aborted fetuses. So if you're going to be consistent, you're probably going to have to throw away a whole lot more than just the vaccine. Second point is that this is I would say, pretty stupid overreaction. Now, Don't hear what I'm not saying. Abortion is a grave evil. In 100 years, people are going to look back on our country like we look back on the Nazis right now because of the grave sin and evil that is abortion. It's wrong. It's horrific. 99.9% of abortions are completely unjustifiable murder for convenience. Full stop. I did a whole podcast episode about this a while back. If you want to know more about that, go back and listen to episode 15, Abortion and Arguing from Extremes. But this type of argument is akin to saying that you should not buy cars from VW, BMW, or Mercedes-Benz because back in World War II, all those companies manufactured equipment for the Nazis. The point of doing things like saying, I'm not going to go buy from that particular company because they do evil things. Like, for example, I'm not going to go buy Apple products because they use what's essentially modern day or contemporary examples of slave labor in the manufacture of their products. And I genuinely don't know if they're doing that right now. I know at least for a fact that they used to do that, although I've heard conflicting things about whether or not they've changed their practices on that. But just use that for example. Well, the reason you would do that is not just because it's wrong to have people essentially working in what amounts to slave labor conditions, but because by not buying the Apple products, you're no longer incentivizing Apple to commit that practice. If you do buy the product, the idea being you're funneling money to Apple, therefore Apple will continue the practice. So, the reason why it would be dumb to say, hey, I'm not going to buy from Volkswagen or Mercedes-Benz because they made war equipment for the Nazis back in World War II is, well, they're no longer making war equipment for the Nazis now. So you're not incentivizing that behavior by buying a product from them. Your purchase of a Volkswagen or a Mercedes-Benz or lack thereof will have absolutely no influence whatsoever, even the remotest possible influence, on what those companies did in World War II. And likewise with the concern that, hey, human cell lines that are descendant from aborted baby tissue are being used to do initial toxicity tests on vaccines. Abortion's an evil, so I can't participate in that. Well, you're taking the vaccine is in no way incentivizing more abortions because those abortions happened a long time ago, and the cell lines are now descendants of that. Now, if it was the case that, say, fetal tissue was used in the manufacture of these vaccines and the companies were going out and seeking fetal tissue for making the vaccines, well, then it'd be a different case, but that's not going on. So you're not incentivizing more abortions in any way whatsoever by taking vaccines or using modern medicine or using any kind of pharmaceuticals, even if they had initial toxicity tests on human cell lines that are descendant from human fetal tissue. Man, that was a mouthful to get out. And the reason why you're not incentivizing that is because the evil that was that abortion is already long gone and done. You're not going to affect that one way or another by whether or not you take a vaccine. It just doesn't work that way. Think of it like this, if it helps you think of it a little bit. Suppose you're a police officer and you come across something very, very horrific in your line of duty, which is that you come across a human trafficking ring that's killing people and selling their organs for transplant. And I've heard that actually does happen in some other parts of the world. There's rumors that the Chinese are doing that to some of their ethnic groups that they don't like over there. I don't know if it's true or not. I've heard rumors, but apparently that does go on in other parts of the world, maybe even, unfortunately, here in the U.S. So suppose you come across this place, and after you bust everybody and shut everything down, well, you got a warehouse that's full of human organs. Now, you know that these organs were almost certainly obtained from people who were murdered. These people were murdered for their organs, and the idea being that they're going to then sell the organs off to the highest bidder or something. Well, at that point, the murders are done. So what should you do? Should you burn the lab to the ground and destroy all the organs? Or should you contact all the hospitals you can and say, hey, we got a warehouse full of organs. Who you got waiting on transplants? Well, I think quite clearly you should contact all the hospitals and try and get those organs to people who need them. Because the evil that was those murders is already long gone and done. You can't do anything about it. And you're not going to incentivize more murders by contacting hospitals and saying, hey, let's get these organs to the people who need them. Likewise, when it comes to abortion, the evil that is the abortion is already done. You're not going to incentivize more abortions by taking a vaccine or by taking pharmaceuticals that were tested for toxicity and maybe some other things on cell lines that are descendant from fetal tissue that came from those abortions. If anything, since that evil is already done, it would be better to try to bring some good out of it. And this is easy to see in the case of the organ example especially. It's much better to have some good come out of that evil that was done than none. Likewise, with aborted fetal tissue, if the abortion's long gone and done, and they're now using to develop vaccines and other pharmaceuticals that can increase human life and longevity and decrease suffering, then, hey, at least some good has come out of that evil. Still would be better if the abortion had never happened, but better to bring some good out of evil than to just have nothing good come out of it whatsoever. Okay, so with all that done, I'm going to briefly tell you why I think so many people are refusing the vaccines and why at least some people aren't going to be moved by these arguments and answers to objections at all. And that's because, as has been well established in the scientific literature, human beings have very tribalistic natures, which means we look for a tribe or group we can identify ourselves with, and we try and fall kind of lock and step in with that group. And even when the group says and does things that are wrong, we'll still defend it against outside groups. The easiest example of this is in politics when you look at the Republicans or conservatives as a tribe versus the Democrats or liberals as a tribe, because we can easily point to all kinds of examples of them doing horrifically stupid things and horrifically wrong things that adhere to their allegiance to their tribe but are horrifically stupid and horrifically wrong. There's even soft examples of this, like I don't remember the exact citation, but there's a social science experiment that was done where somebody is asked to join a group of people and they're comparing lengths of a line, like a line on a paper, and unbeknownst to the test subject, everyone else in there is a plant, and they're going to say the wrong thing. That is, they're going to say, oh, those lines are the same length when they're not, or those lines are not the same length when they are. And somewhat interestingly, most people, when they're put through that experiment, will go with the group and actually say the wrong thing rather than be on the out group. And that's just because that's how we as human beings are designed socially to work. And if you think about it rationally, whether you want to attribute this to evolutionary processes or the way God created us, the distinction there doesn't matter here. It's actually a pretty rational thing to do if you are in a, say, small family group or a small clan group or something like that, to go with what the group says over what you think, even if the group is wrong. Because getting cast out from the group is far worse than just having a couple of wrong beliefs that the group thinks, at least most of the time. Obviously, there's some variance in this. This is all generalization here. And since for most of our history, that's what most of us human beings lived in, we lived in small family groups, we lived in smaller clans. For the longest period of history, the vast majority of people who lived never journeyed more than like 25 or 50 miles away from their place of birth. Well, now in recent years, that's changed considerably, and you have all these groups bumping into each other and in conflict and so on and so forth. But we human beings still have those tribalistic tendencies. And so, I think part of what's going on here is tribalistic tendencies telling people, where people are saying, I'm not going to get the vaccine because the people who are in my tribe, the people who are like me, the people who think like me, the people who act like me, the people who look like me, the people who go to the same church as me, they're not going to get the vaccine either. At least that's what they're telling me to do. So that makes me suspicious. And because that's a baseline thing in how we as human beings operate, then it's very, very difficult to actually overcome that even with rational argument. Now, fortunately, the group of people I hang around with, my wife, my family, the people at my church, we were all pretty much on board with getting the vaccine. So it's easy for me to see, oh, that's a good idea, because I didn't have to go against my, for lack of a better term, tribe to get it. Had I had to go against my tribe to get it, it would have been much more socially difficult for me to do that. Now, I do sometimes wonder, well, what are the bad ideas that my tribe promotes that I've just accepted to go along with it, that it's hard for me to see no matter what rational argument people give to me? And I'm sure if you've been listening for a while, you might actually have a few ideas of what those are. So write in and tell me where I'm wrong and where my tribe's encouraging me to go the wrong way so I could at least think about it. So that's what I think is going on in the background when most people actually reject these vaccines, that it doesn't have anything to do with rational reasons. It's completely for social reasons. But for other social reasons, it's not really acceptable for people to come out and say, I'm not doing this for social reasons. They have to try to appeal to something rational. But their rational reasons for not taking the vaccine fall apart under any examination, and the rational reasons for taking it are significantly stronger. So that's why I fully expect, if I did get any anti-vaxxer to listen to this podcast all the way to the end here, that you're probably not convinced. But that's because I think for the most part, you're not objecting to it for rational reasons. Now that's probably going to get, if there is anybody like that actually listening, some of you angry. But I point that out for the simple fact that that might actually convince some of you to re-examine your reasons instead of just trying to quibble with me about how the arguments did or didn't work and realize, oh, yeah, I'm probably not rejecting this vaccine for rational reasons. So, anyhow, those are my two arguments as to why you should take the vaccine. I gave you a practical one that the risk of taking the vaccine is always going to be significantly, in fact, exponentially less than the risk of not taking the vaccine. And further, that you have a moral obligation to do it for the people around you and for your fellow human beings in general, because the risk is so inherently low, it costs you, if not nothing, next to nothing, and it's going to be beneficial to yourself, the people around you, and human beings in general. So, what do you think of those arguments? Do you think they're good? Do you think they're bad? Where do you find them weak or strong? Write in, let me know what you think. I'm always open for any kind of comment. You can reach me at theexaminelifewithphil@gmail.com or send me a message over the Facebook page. Just type in The Examine Life with Phil and you'll find it. And I hope to be back again with something else for you. Maybe go back to doing some stuff on story in about 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
The mission of Holy Apostles College and Seminary is to form faithful witnesses of Christ. Year after year, the prestigious Newman Guide has recommended Holy Apostles for our academic excellence and steadfast fidelity to the magisterial teachings of the Catholic Church. We are also fully accredited and the leader in Catholic online learning. Our students enjoy the unsurpassed flexibility to study on their own time and anywhere in the world through asynchronous engagement. Holy Apostles is dedicated to the relentless pursuit of truth, which allows students in all academic programs, including undergraduate, graduate, and personal interest, to formulate a coherent worldview based on both faith and reason. The study of the liberal arts also develops and refines key competencies associated with career readiness, such as critical thinking and problem solving, clear communication, collaboration, and a strong work ethic. The tuition rate at Holy Apostles is one of the most affordable in the country. Yearly tuition for a full-time undergraduate is under $12,000. Students at Holy Apostles can graduate with minimal or even no college debt, which enables them to live out their calling as faithful witnesses of Christ without heavy financial burdens holding them back. Please visit www.holyapostles.edu/admissions for more information. The Fall 2021 admissions deadline is Friday, July 23rd. Classes start Monday, August 30th. See you soon.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.